Western Xia, the Silk Road's desert empire. What if an entire empire, its cities, its scriptures, its people, was so thoroughly erased that scholars spent centuries not knowing it existed? That empire was Western Xia. Its story begins on the Silk Road. Western Xia, Xia in Chinese, was a dynasty founded by the Tangut people in 1038 CE. It occupied the corridor between Central Asia and China proper, sitting directly across the most lucrative trade arteries on Earth. The Silk Road wasn't a single road. It was a web of overland and maritime routes connecting China to the Mediterranean. Whoever controlled key segments controlled the flow of silk, spices, horses, and ideas. And Western Xia controlled a critical choke point. Here's a misconception worth dismantling. Many assumed China was a single, unified empire when Genghis Khan invaded. It wasn't. The region was fractured among Western Xia, the Jin dynasty in the north, and the Southern Song further south. Western Xia levied fees on every merchant crossing its territory. Geographic position became a revenue engine, one that funded its military, its monasteries, and its court. The Hexi Corridor didn't just connect empires, it paid for one. Western Xia wasn't merely a toll booth. The Tangut rulers were devoted patrons of Buddhism, commissioning thousands of manuscripts, sculptures, and cave temples. Their Buddhist culture rivaled any contemporary civilization in Central Asia. The Tanguts created their own writing system, a script of staggering complexity, with over 6,000 characters. This wasn't administrative convenience. It was a declaration. Western Xia was not a vassal of China, but a sovereign civilization with its own intellectual tradition. Then, from the Mongolian steppe, Genghis Khan unified the nomadic tribes by 1206 and looked outward immediately. Western Xia was among his first targets, not because it was the most powerful enemy, but because controlling it meant controlling access to China. Mongol cavalry could cover up to 100 miles per day. Their armies combined psychological terror with genuine tactical innovation, and they'd already demonstrated the capacity for swift, devastating campaigns across vast distances. Genghis Khan launched not one, but multiple campaigns against Western Xia between 1205 and 1227. The Tanguts resisted far longer than most of his targets, extracting concessions, paying tribute, surviving, until the final campaign that erased them entirely. Here's the counterintuitive twist. The Mongol invasions, which would eventually reunify the Silk Road under a single power, first crippled it. The campaigns through Central Asia severed trade networks that merchants had relied on for generations, sending shockwaves through economies from Baghdad to Beijing. The Mongol destruction of the Khwarezm Empire between 1219 and 1221 is the clearest example. Cities like Samarkand and Urgench, major Silk Road hubs, were devastated. Centuries of commerce were rerouted overnight. Here's the paradox made concrete. Persian historian Juvaini estimated the Mongol sack of Merv in 1221 killed over 1 million people. Almost certainly an exaggeration, but conservative modern estimates still place the toll in the hundreds of thousands. Yet within 40 years, the same Mongol Empire was issuing standardized merchant passports called paisi, guaranteeing safe passage from Beijing to Persia. The army that annihilated cities became the institution that made transcontinental commerce safer than it had ever been. The final reckoning for Western Xia came in 1227. Genghis Khan led the campaign personally. Western Xia fell that year, and what followed wasn't merely military defeat. It was systematic obliteration that historians still struggle to fully document. The Mongols reportedly ordered Western Xia's records destroyed and its population decimated. Later Chinese dynasties, working from Mongol-era sources, largely omitted Western Xia from official histories. An empire that had endured nearly 2 centuries was reduced to archaeological fragments and silence. The survival of Buddhist manuscripts, discovered at Karakoto in the early 20th century, gives us the most direct window into what was destroyed. Thousands of Tangut texts on medicine, law, astrology, and Buddhist philosophy survived only because they were buried before the Mongols arrived. But here's the surprise that recasts everything. Despite the violence of conquest, the Mongol Empire became the last great patron of Silk Road trade. Once the campaigns ended, the Mongols maintained stability across their territory, with a consistency no previous power had achieved. Historians call this the Pax Mongolica, Mongol peace. Under it, merchants could travel from the Pacific coast to the Black Sea under a single legal and military umbrella. The Mongol invasions initially fractured the Silk Road, then rebuilt it at a scale no predecessor had managed. Before Mongol unification, crossing the Silk Road meant negotiating separate tariff systems at each political border. Western Xia, Jin, Khwarezm, and beyond. The Mongols collapsed those borders. Merchants who survived the conquest era entered a radically simplified trading environment. The Mongol successor state in China, the Yuan dynasty, established by Kublai Khan in 1271, continued this trade patronage initially. But prosperity began to wane as internal fragmentation and the Black Death tore through the networks the Mongols had built. Western Xia's obliteration raises a question that echoes far beyond medieval Central Asia. How many other civilizations have been erased so completely that we don't yet know to look for them? The Tanguts had a script, a legal code, a Buddhist canon, and still nearly vanished from memory. The Silk Road wasn't a natural feature of geography. It was a political construction, maintained by states willing to protect merchants and honor agreements. When states collapsed violently, as Western Xia did, entire nodes of the network ceased to function. The Mongol Empire's trajectory, from destroyer to patron, illustrates something counterintuitive about trade networks. They can survive military catastrophe, but only if a successor power invests in their maintenance. The clearest proof came after the Mongols themselves fragmented. When the Ilkhanate collapsed in 1335 and the Chagatai Khanate splintered through the 1340s, the overland Silk Road didn't recover from violence. It died from institutional neglect. No successor state rebuilt the caravanserais, reissued the merchant passports, or guaranteed safe passage. Abandonment finished what no army had managed to do. Not everything was destroyed. The Buddhist manuscripts buried at Karakoto survived. Tangut artworks preserved in Russian and Chinese collections survived. Western Xia's Buddhist culture left physical traces the Mongol campaign couldn't reach, because the Tanguts had hidden them first. Remember the misconception from the start, that China was a single unified power when the Mongols arrived. That fragmentation is precisely what made Western Xia's position so valuable and so dangerous. A unified China might have defended it. A fractured one couldn't. Here's a question historians rarely ask directly. What did the Silk Road lose when Western Xia fell? Not just a tariff checkpoint, but a translation hub, a Buddhist scholarly center, a cultural intermediary between Tibetan, Chinese, and Central Asian traditions. The network lost a node it couldn't replace. Western Xia was only reintegrated into serious historical scholarship in the 20th century, largely through the excavation of Karakoto by Russian explorer Pyotr Kozlov in 1908 and 1909. Thousands of Tangut texts and artifacts emerged from the sand, forcing historians to redraw the map of medieval Asia. Western Xia story reveals that the Silk Road was never just about silk. It was a transmission belt for religion, language, art, and governance. The Tanguts absorbed Buddhist philosophy from Tibet, legal structures from Tang China, trade goods from Persia, and synthesized them into something genuinely original. The final irony is this: the Mongol Empire, which destroyed Western Xia and temporarily crippled trade from the Middle East to China, created the conditions that made Marco Polo's journey possible in 1271. The geographic knowledge Polo brought back to Europe directly shaped the ambitions of 15th-century explorers. When the Ottoman Empire closed the overland routes after 1453, European powers were already primed to seek maritime alternatives, because Pax Mongolica had demonstrated how profitable a direct connection to Asia could be. The destruction of Western Xia was one early link in a chain that ended with Columbus. Western Xia isn't even the only Silk Road civilization erased this thoroughly. The Sogdians, merchant diplomats based in cities like Afrasiab and Panjikent in modern Uzbekistan, dominated Central Asian trade for centuries before the Arab conquests of the 7th and 8th centuries absorbed and dissolved their culture. Like the Tanguts, the Sogdians left behind manuscripts and murals that survived only because they were sealed in collapsed buildings. Two civilizations, separated by 5 centuries, erased by the same mechanism: conquest followed by the victor's rewriting of the record. Every trade network in history has had its Western Xias, essential nodes that history forgot because the winners wrote the record. The Silk Road's full story isn't the story of China and Rome. It's the story of every empire in between that made the connection possible and paid the price for it. Here's what to do with this. The next time you read a history of any major empire, Chinese, Roman, Ottoman, Mongol, ask who's missing from the official account and who wrote the sources. Western Xia vanished partly because the Mongols destroyed its records, and partly because later dynasties had no incentive to restore them. Official histories aren't neutral archives, they're political documents. Reading them critically and seeking out the archaeology and the minority language manuscripts that bypass the victors entirely is how you find the civilizations that were meant to stay lost. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this video, subscribe for more.